And that reminds me of a term I've heard before, this reasonable man concept, or woman, or maybe they say reasonable person these days. It seems to me that covers a multitude of sins and is a great kind of focal point to leverage, your legal arguments around.
Yeah, the reasonable person is a fictional character who's perfectly prudent in everything that he or she does, always makes the, careful and right decision, although, sometimes we give them a little leeway and say under these particular circumstances, we're not going to expect you to act perfectly. But it's not a real person, and it's a standard that we hold people to. And it's an objective standard that is created as an agreement, so to speak. So if the judge is convinced that this is what the reasonable person would do under these circumstances, and maybe based on the case law, so that common law, case law comes in to tell us what does the reasonable person do under these circumstances. You're held to that standard, and that's why I talked about self-help, for instance. The reasonable person doesn't want to breach the peace, so they tend not to do self-help, for instance.
So can the reasonable person concept kind of trump the case law, so to speak?
No, the case law tells us what the reasonable person would do, if that makes sense.
Okay, and that's why case law is an evolving thing, because as times change, a reasonable thing to do, in that context also changes.
Right, like we were talking about, and you guys pointed out to me that if I was painting the ends of the tree limbs, which would seem like a great idea to me, a reasonable person would no longer do that given the state of the art. Now, we also talk about the reasonably prudent expert, or the reasonable degree of medical certainty for doctors, or the reasonable degree of care for a tree trimmer or a horticultural expert. So then we have that standard as well, which is kind of like what the reasonable expert or reasonable person with that specialized knowledge would do.
Eric Vorodi, consultant from About Trees Consulting, and Karl Rominger here. We're talking about trees and the law, and kind of a topic that both Eric and I have discussed before. I have to tell you the story. And Eric, I don't know if you've been the beneficiary of this, but my experience with tree appraisals and this whole business that gets folks and like myself and individuals wrapped up in the law has been very discouraging. My experience is going to court is that folks aren't, they're not interested in an amicable resolution. And my favorite story is about the tree appraisal, and we can talk maybe a little bit about that. The tree appraisal that, in my estimation, for the loss of a few trees on a property, way exceeded the value of the property. But once these folks had it in their mind that these trees were worth an awful lot of money, they saw the money on the table and then just pursued this, despite what I thought were reasonable arguments to the contrary.
And this concept just came up. As a matter of fact, it's probably sitting in your office right now in the latest issue of Tree Care Industry Association magazine. There's a counterpoint to that, an article by an arborist who's saying it is reasonable to understand that a tree could have more value than the real estate, because you'll sometimes get challenged in court where the question will come up, well, are you a real estate appraiser? How can you say that tree is worth this much when the real estate value of the property is worth X dollars? And so you'll sometimes even have to bolster your appraisal by bringing in a real estate appraiser. But the argument has been made, and cases have been made in court successfully, that a tree could outstrip or outweigh the value of a piece of real estate. And I know that drives you crazy.
And do we have any examples of that? Can you think of a good example of that locally that might represent that?
I don't know about a local example, but an example that another arborist, a case that he put up where somebody had removed a large silver maple, a tree that you and I in most cases would consider not to be a
hazardous by nature.
Right, just a weak wooded tree that's prone to falling apart in old age, and we wouldn't generally consider it a great landscape tree. But in his case, the appraisal that he used was for cost of cure, and it was not to replace that tree, but to replace the benefits that tree had provided. And so he spec'd the installation of two very large 10, 12-inch caliper tulip poplars to replace the one silver maple, because he wanted to replace the benefits of the privacy, the blocked view. Well, as you can imagine, transplanting two 10 or 12-inch caliper tulip poplars at maybe $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a piece, you'd say, well, how could that one tree have been worth $40,000 or $80,000?
And just a little sidebar to that. I mean, that's like that's jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. Tulip poplars are probably follow very closely to silver maples as poor trees to plant anywhere near your house.
Yeah.
I have a friend, and she has a porch where the landscaping of the trees in the yard and the bushes have created sort of and it's a front porch, so you can literally sit out there and be completely in an enclave, almost surrounded by the woods. And so I could imagine if somebody bought that house and saw that as a feature, and said, wow, this is great. I can sit on my front porch. I can still kind of see the road, but I can have kind of privacy, but the air is moving through, and it's just beautiful because the way all the three trees combine with the bushes. So that would have value.